On the morning of the 28th of January, 1949, at 38 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, in a small canvas trackside command tent pitched on the gravel ballast of the Union Pacific Railroad's North Platte to Valentine branch, where it met the small Sandhills cattle town of Cody, Nebraska, 3 uniformed Union Pacific engineers in heavy navy wool greatcoats and brakeman's caps with chin straps tied down stood around a portable kerosene heater and signed off on the record on a formal operations memorandum to the Union Pacific General Manager in Omaha that began with one short sentence and ended with another. The first sentence read, "Subject stranded passenger. Consist number 47 20-mile drift, milepost 312.4 to 334.6, Cherry County, Nebraska." The last sentence read, "Recommendation: the consist cannot be reached by any equipment in the Union Pacific Western Division's inventory until the spring thaw." 6 days into a continuous 22-mile hard-packed snowdrift on a long curving Sandhills cut line at the absolute coldest week of the entire winter of 1948 to 1949, Union Pacific had been beaten by a piece of weather. 12 miles east of Cody, buried in that drift up to the cab windows, sat a 1947 EMDF-3 diesel-electric 3-unit locomotive consist in factory armor yellow and harbor mist gray paint. 2 more F3 units behind it, also dead, a heated diner car frozen on its trucks, and 4 heavyweight Pullman sleepers with 141 civilian passengers still on board. The diesel fuel in the F3 prime movers had gelled at -28 on the second night and had not, for 96 straight hours since, returned to a state from which any of the 3 locomotives could be restarted. The 2 UP Caterpillar D7 dozers sent in from the Valentine maintenance shop on the 3rd day had each, inside 4 hours of working the drift, sunk to their tracks and stalled. The diner car coal stove, by the morning of the 6th day, was on hour-by-hour rationing. The passengers were alive. The youngest was 11 months old. The operations memorandum, when it was teletyped to Omaha at 9:14 a.m. on the 28th of January, formally proposed to the general manager the next step option of evacuating the passengers across the drift on foot, in groups behind a chain of UP linesmen, the 8 miles back to Cody, a proposal that the senior officer signing the memorandum, a Mr. Howard McCleish of the UP Omaha Engineering Office, knew in his bones, at -38 degrees, none of the older passengers and none of the small children would survive. What Howard McCleish did not know, standing there in the canvas command tent in his Navy greatcoat, signing the worst operations memorandum he would ever sign in his 31 years with the Union Pacific Railroad, was that the answer to the entire problem he had just signed off as impossible was, that same morning, parked under a cottonwood-pole hay shed beside the barn of a 76-year-old Swedish-American Sandhills cattle and hay rancher named Sigurd Lindquist, 7 miles north up the section line. To understand why a 76-year-old Swedish-American rancher in Cherry County, Nebraska, was about to become the answer to a question the Union Pacific Railroad had just spent 6 days failing to solve, you had to go back 55 winters to the November of 1894, when a 21-year-old immigrant cabinet maker named Sigurd Lindquist Siggy, to everyone stepped off a Burlington Route No. 41 emigrant car at the small wooden depot in Long Pine, Nebraska, with $11 in coin and a single planing chisel in the inside pocket of his coat, and walked in 3 days through the Sandhills, the 42 miles northwest, to a piece of open shortgrass and sand range he had been corresponding about by mail from Stockholm for 17 straight months with a Lutheran pastor's daughter named Karen Almgren. He filed on the half-section under the Kincaid Act Amendment of 1904. He married Karen Almgren at the small Swede Methodist Mission Church at Brownlee in 1898. He and Karen built the first sod-roofed half-dugout on the section in 1898, the small frame extension to the dugout in 1903, and the low sod-and-frame ranch house they would live in for the next half-century in 1910. They wintered between 1894 and 1949, 55 straight Sandhills winters in those same rooms. They raised 7 children. They buried 2 in 1918. They built, with their own hands, 15. Miles of cedar post and barbed wire range fence across rolling sand dune country. Sigurd Lindquist had bought the 1924 Advance Rumely OilPull Model H, brand new, in May of 1924 from the Advance Rumely dealer in Valentine, Nebraska, for $1,790, almost exactly the cash profit of his 4 best post-war hay seasons. He had chosen the oil pull over the cheaper and lighter John Deere D and Fordson F tractors then on the market, because the oil pull was the only farm tractor in the world in 1924 that ran on kerosene rather than gasoline, that had a slow 2-cylinder low RPM engine with massive sustained drawbar torque, and that alone of every farm tractor then offered in the United States was rated by Advance Rumely's own LaPorte, Indiana engineering office to start and to run reliably at any ambient temperature down to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Sigurd Lindquist had spent the 25 Nebraska winters between 1924 and 1949 quietly making 3 modifications to the oil pull in his own ranch shop, with his own gas forge and his own bench. Arc welder. He had, in the winter of 1925, custom-fitted, oversized, cleated grousers to the original Rumely steel-spoke drive wheels, grousers 14 inches wider than factory. The leading face of each cleat, angled at 20 degrees off square, the exact same physical principle of foot width and cleat angle. Walt Carlson would rediscover for himself on Black Gumbo in North Dakota 46 years later. And Ed Halverson would learn for himself on wet Olympic Peninsula Mountain, ground a year before Sigurd had been born. He had, in the winter of 1927, replaced the original Rumely fuel priming system with a hand blow-torched manifold warming jig of his own design, which allowed the oil pull to be cold-started at any temperature in the Sandhills winter by warming the intake manifold, and the 2 cylinders for exactly 7 minutes from a 1-quart kerosene blowtorch before the cranking pin was ever touched. And he had, in the winter of 1937, fitted the oil pull with a long, heavy steel cable spool bolted to the rear deck behind the operator's platform, wound with 800 feet of 3/4-inch steel cable he had bought, used, from a Burlington route maintenance of way crew at Long Pine, who had had no use for it after the Burlington had finally retired its last steam wrecker. By the morning of the 28th of January, 1949, what stood under the cottonwood-pole hay shed beside Sigurd Lindquist's barn was not, by any specification that mattered, a stock 1924 Rumely OilPull Model H. It was a Sigurd Lindquist tractor set up by him across 25 Sandhills winters, for cold weather, for hard-packed snow, for low RPM cable pulling on uncertain footing, and for the one specific purpose of doing exactly the work that morning, would be asked of it. It was 38 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Sigurd Lindquist was drinking his second cup of black coffee at the kitchen table of the low sod-and-frame ranch house. Karen Lindquist, small and sharp-eyed at 73, knitting a pair of children's wool mittens for a great-grandchild in Hyannis, was at the same table. The shortwave radio above the kitchen sideboard, which Siggy had built with his own hands from a health kit in 1946, had been carrying the bulletin out of the Cody Western Union office for 90 minutes every 15 minutes, on rotation. A consist on the North Platte branch, 6 days, 22-mile drift, 141 passengers. The Union Pacific Omaha engineering office had, at 9:14 a.m., declared the consist unreachable until the spring thaw. Siggy Lindquist had drunk his second cup of coffee. He had set the cup down on the saucer exactly once, with a small, careful click. He had looked at Karen Lindquist across the oilcloth table. Karen Lindquist had looked back at him. She had said, in their Lutheran Swedish-American English with the Sandhills shape across the long vowels, "Sigurd, you go." She had said only that. Siggy Lindquist had nodded once. He had put on his sheepskin-lined canvas chore coat, his fur-lined leather aviator cap, with the ear flaps tied down, and his chopper mitts. He had walked through the back hall, out the kitchen door, across the snow-packed yard, to the cottonwood-pole hay shed. He had pulled the canvas dust cover off the front of the 1924 Rumely OilPull Model H. He had lit his 1-quart kerosene blowtorch, and he had begun, in the absolute hard, cold quiet of a 38 below Sandhills morning, to warm the intake manifold of his own tractor. Sigurd Lindquist drove the 7 miles south from his ranch to the Union Pacific command tent at Cody that morning in a borrowed 1939 Model A truck owned by his nearest neighbor, a 67-year-old Swede named Lars Brandholm, because the oil pull would walk where the Model A could not, but the oil pull would also take nearly 5 hours to make the 7-mile section road trip in deep snow at -38. And Sigurd Lindquist intended to make the offer first, and the trip with the oil pull second. He drove the Model A slowly down 2.5 miles of cleared section road and 4.5 miles of half-cleared county road in chopper mitts and a leather aviator cap, the heater of the Model A running on its highest setting and barely melting the inside of the windshield. He arrived at the Cody railhead at 12 minutes past 10 in the morning. Howard McLeish, the senior UP Omaha engineering officer in the command tent, was 48 years old. He had been with Union Pacific since 1918. He had run mainline operations through the great Wyoming blizzards of 1929 and 1936. He had, between 1942 and 1946, served on the Union Pacific's Wartime National Defense Transportation Board Liaison Committee in Omaha. He was, by every honest standard, one of the 3 or 4 best winter operations engineers the Union Pacific had ever fielded, and he had, by the morning of the 28th of January 1949, signed the worst operations memorandum of his career exactly 46 minutes before Sigurd Lindquist walked across the gravel ballast of the Cody railhead in chopper mitts. Howard McLeish was not a stupid man. He was not, on a good day, even an arrogant one. But he was, on the morning of the 28th of January 1949, a man who had been awake for 61 hours in a row, who had spent 6 days watching his own railroad engineering instincts be defeated by a single piece of weather, and who had, 8 minutes before Sigurd Lindquist stepped into his command tent, just finished writing the operative phrase until the spring thaw in his own hand on a Union Pacific operations form. The other 2 engineers in the command tent that morning were a 32-year-old assistant engineer named Donald Hewitt from the Omaha Engineering Office and the lead UP linesman of the Valentine Maintenance District, a 39-year-old Bohemian American named Frank Vacek, who had grown up in a small Sandhills section crew town called Eli, 15 miles east of Sigurd Lindquist's ranch, and who had known of Sigurd Lindquist by name and by reputation since 1925. Sigurd Lindquist stepped into the canvas tent in his sheepskin coat and aviator cap and chopper mitts, took the chopper mitts off slowly, exposed 2 square frostbite-scarred hands with the 3rd knuckle of the right one missing, and stood quietly until the 3 uniformed UP men noticed him. Howard McLeish said, in the polite, tired voice of a man trying to be courteous to one more local well-wisher in a long week of them, "Sir, good morning, Mr. McLeish, Union Pacific Omaha. May I ask your name?" Sigurd Lindquist said, "Sigurd Lindquist. I have a ranch 7 miles north up the section line. I have been listening to your shortwave bulletins for the better part of a week. I believe I can reach your train, Mr. McLeish." Howard McLeish looked at him. Sigurd Lindquist did not break his gaze. Howard McLeish said, more gently than he might have on a less tired morning, "Sir, we appreciate your offer. We appreciate the spirit in which it is being made. We have, however, just sent the Omaha office a formal engineering recommendation that the consist cannot be reached with current equipment until the spring thaw. 2 of our own D7 dozers are stuck in the drift. The diesel fuel in our locomotives is gelled. The ambient temperature in this tent right now, Mr. Lindquist, is 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with the kerosene heater running on its highest setting, The temperature outside is -38. May I ask, sir, and please understand, the question is meant respectfully what equipment you propose to use? Sigurd Lindquist said, in his quiet Sandhills English with the Swedish edge. Mr. McLeish, I have a 1924 Advanced Rumely OilPull Model H, kerosene-burning, 2 cylinders, low RPM, custom-fitted oversized cleated grousers, 800 feet of 3/4-inch steel. Cable. I have wintered 55 Sandhills winters. The tractor has wintered 25. It will start at 40 below. It does not gel. I will walk it the 7 miles down the section line to your railhead this afternoon. I will walk it across your drift tonight, in low gear, in the moonlight, when the wind is down. I will reach your train before the wind comes up tomorrow. I will hook your Pullman cars one at a time to the oil-pull drawbar, and I will walk your passengers back to this railhead at the speed the oil-pull will walk them, which is about 2.5 miles to the hour. We will be done, weather holding, by sundown the day after tomorrow. Donald Hewitt, the 32-year-old assistant engineer from the Omaha office who had graduated from the University of Nebraska College of Engineering in 1940 and who had spent the last 9 years inside one Union Pacific building or another, laughed. He could not quite help it. He said, half under his breath, in a voice that carried in the canvas tent, "Sir, with respect, the Union Pacific Railroad does not, in 1949, rescue passengers with an antique kerosene tractor." Howard McLeish, on a good day, would have stopped him. On the morning of the 28th of January, 1949, after 61 hours awake, Howard McLeish did not stop him. It was Frank Vacek, the 39-year-old Bohemian-American lead UP linesman from Valentine, who had known of Sigurd Lindquist by name and by reputation since 1925, who, at the back of the canvas tent, in a quiet voice, said, "Mr. McLeish, sir, may I speak with you outside for a moment?" Howard McLeish looked at Frank Vacek for one long count. Frank Vacek was a quiet man. He had not, in the 6 days the Union Pacific had been working the Cody drift, asked to speak to Howard McLeish privately, even once. Howard McLeish put on his greatcoat. He stepped out of the tent with Frank Vacek into the still, hard Arctic air. They stood for the better part of 3 minutes beside the cab of the lead F3, buried up to its handrail, in the drift in their breath, in the cold. Frank Vacek told Howard McLeish exactly 4 things, in this order. He told him, first, that Sigurd Lindquist had homesteaded on the north section line of Cherry County in 1894, and had wintered every one of the previous 55 Sandhills winters in the same low sod-and-frame ranch house. He told him, second, that in the bad winter of 1936, when Frank Vacek had been a 26-year-old UP linesman second-class Sigurd Lindquist, and the same 1924 oil pull had, on personal initiative, recovered a stranded Union Pacific section house crew of 4 men from a half-buried section house at milepost 326 with no fanfare, no payment, and no formal request, and had been thanked, on the record, in writing, by the Valentine maintenance superintendent of the day in a letter that was still in the Valentine Division file cabinet. He told him, third, that the Cody drift was the same kind of hard-packed continuous wind Sandhills drift the 1936 drift had been, and that he, Frank Vacek, who had spent 30 years on the same section of track, did not believe any standard piece of UP equipment was going to clear that drift before the wind came up on Sunday afternoon and made it worse. He told him, fourth and last, that the 1924 Rumely OilPull Model H was, to the best of his Bohemian Sandhills knowledge of the matter, the only piece of mechanical equipment within 700 miles of Cody, Nebraska, that was certified by its own manufacturer to operate reliably at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and that Sigurd Lindquist was, to the best of the same knowledge, the only man living between Omaha and the Black Hills who had wintered the same tractor for 25 consecutive Sandhills winters. Frank Vacek said in his quiet UP linesman's voice, "Mr. McLeish, with respect, sir, The Omaha Memorandum is going to read poorly in 50 years if a UP engineer in a wool greatcoat tells a 76-year-old Swede with a kerosene tractor that the Union Pacific does not rescue passengers with antique equipment, and then a Pullman car of children dies in the diner car on Sunday night. Sir. Howard McLeish stood in the cold beside the cab of the lead F3 for one more long count. Then he set his hand, briefly, on the cold yellow steel of the F3's nose. He walked back to the command tent. He stepped inside. He looked at Donald Hewitt and at Sigurd Lindquist, standing patient and steady on the canvas floor with his chopper mitts held in his right hand, and he said clearly enough for every man in the tent to hear, "Mr. Lindquist, the Union Pacific Railroad would be deeply obliged for your assistance. Mr. Hewitt will telephone the Valentine office at noon and amend the operations memorandum. Mr. Vacek will travel with you back to your ranch this afternoon and assist in any way he can. Whatever you need from this railroad, sir, you will have until your train and your passengers are back on this gravel. Are we clear?" Sigurd Lindquist said, "Yes, Mr. McLeish." He put his chopper mitts back on. He shook Howard McLeish's hand. He nodded once to Frank Vacek. He said nothing at all to Donald Hewitt. And he walked out of the canvas tent, across the gravel ballast of the Cody railhead, climbed into the cab of Lars Brandholm's 1939 Model A truck, started the motor with Frank Vacek in the passenger seat beside him, and drove the 7 miles north up the section line, back to his ranch, in the still hard Arctic noon with the brassy low plains sun on the windshield of the truck in front of them. What Siggy Lindquist did over the next 32 hours between 1 o'clock on the afternoon of the 28th of January 1949, when the Model A pulled into the yard of his low sod-and-frame ranch house, and just after 9 o'clock on the evening of the 29th of January, when the last of 141 Union Pacific passengers stepped down off the rear platform of the last Pullman car onto the gravel ballast of the Cody railhead, became, in the quiet way these things happen in small Sandhills cattle communities, one of the 4 stories the old ranchers in Brownlee, and Brewster and Hyannis and Woodlake and Valentine still told about in the small cafes in the early 1990s, when the youngest of the children who had walked off the Pullman platform that night was a 43-year-old emergency room surgeon at the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha named Eleanor Bender. He did 3 things in the right order. He did them slowly, he did them very carefully, and he did the first thing inside the cottonwood-pole hayshed of his own ranch yard. He warmed the intake manifold of the 1924 Rumely OilPull Model H with his 1-quart kerosene blowtorch for the full 7 minutes Advance Rumely had specified in the Laporte Engineering Bulletin of 1924, in air that was 36 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. He cranked the heavy starting pin on the 7th minute. The slow 2-cylinder kerosene engine caught on the second pull and settled into its patient low RPM working chug at 530 revolutions a minute, exactly as the Laporte Engineering Bulletin had promised. He let the oil pull idle in the cottonwood shed for the better part of 45 minutes in its own slow warming cloud of kerosene exhaust, until the heavy iron drawbar was warm to the touch in his chopper mitt. The second thing he did was rigging. Frank Vacek, in his UP linesman's coat, helped him lift the 800-foot spool of 3/4-inch steel cable onto the rear deck behind the operator's platform, check the heavy steel drawbar shackle, and chain 4 heavy Karen Lindquist knitted wool blankets for the children onto the rear platform under a tied canvas tarp. The third thing he did, and the thing the Union Pacific Western Division would, in subsequent operations bulletins, formally name the Lindquist Transit Method, was walk the oil pull, in low gear, at 2.5 miles to the hour, the 7 miles south on the section line from his ranch yard to the Cody railhead, the 8 miles east along the rail bed itself, across the hard-packed surface of the 22-mile Cody drift, by the light of a full waning moon and a battery-powered Atico lantern lashed to the cooling tower in still air at -38 degrees, with Frank Vacek walking the entire way on foot, 50 feet ahead of the oil pull as a forward scout for soft drift edges and ice voids. He reached the rear platform of the last Pullman car of the stranded passenger consist at exactly 23 minutes past 1 in the morning on the 29th of January, 1949. He shut the oil pull down to idle in the lee of the Pullman. He climbed down. He took off his chopper mitts, climbed up onto the brass-railed rear platform of the Pullman, knocked twice on the cold steel door, and was led inside by a 31-year-old UP Pullman conductor named Walter Henderson, who had been awake for the better part of the previous 5 days. Inside the Pullman, in the dim yellow light of 2 coal oil lamps, Walter Henderson had been rationing since the second day. 141 civilian passengers, 68 of them women, 39 of them children, were wrapped in every wool blanket and overcoat the consist had carried, sharing body heat in the seats. The diner car coal stove 3 cars forward was on its last 6 hours of rationed coal. Sigurd Lindquist took off his fur-lined leather aviator cap inside the Pullman, set it on the conductor's small desk, and said in his quiet Sandhills English with the Swedish edge, loud enough only that Walter Henderson and the 4 nearest passengers could hear. "I am Sigurd Lindquist. I have a kerosene tractor outside. I am going to take you home now. We will walk every one of you to Cody, in lots of about 20 in each Pullman car, hooked to my drawbar. The oil pull will pull a Pullman car at 2.5 miles to the hour. The trip is 8 miles. We will be at the Cody railhead before sundown tomorrow. The children will be first. Mr. Henderson, please bring me the 11-month-old. He hooked his drawbar to the rear coupler of the last Pullman at 1:41 in the morning. He walked it back to the Cody railhead at 2.5 miles to the hour through the long, curving rail cut in the moonlight, with Frank Vacek walking forward scout. He reached Cody at 6:12 in the morning. He turned the oil pull around at the railhead with the wood and canvas turning circle 3 UP linesmen had hand-cleared for him in the night. He walked back to the consist. He hooked the 3rd from last Pullman. He walked it back. He repeated the 8-mile transit in the same patient kerosene engine working chug 4 full times across the next 14 hours through the morning, through the noon, through the brassy low plains after noon, at the same slow, steady 2.5 miles to the hour, in still air that never rose above -32 degrees Fahrenheit. He walked 141 civilian passengers, including 39 children, including an 11-month-old, off the Cody drift in a 1924 Rumely OilPull Model H by the morning and the day and the early evening of the 29th of January, 1949, without losing a single one of them, without ever once exceeding 530 revolutions a minute of the slow 2-cylinder kerosene engine, and without one single moment of cleat spin on the heavy custom-welded oversized grousers Siggy Lindquist had welded on with his own bench arc welder in the winter of 1925. The last Pullman car cleared the Cody railhead at 3 minutes past 9 on the evening of the 29th of January. The temperature on the Union Pacific platform thermometer at that hour was -36 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind, which had been forecast to come up out of the southeast by sundown, had by the small mercy of the only piece of weather that broke right for the Union Pacific Railroad in any of the previous 9 days held still until 5 minutes past 10 o'clock that evening. Sigurd Lindquist had beaten the wind by 62 minutes. The Union Pacific Railroad Amended Operations Memorandum 47D, the document Howard McLeish had signed on the morning of the 28th of January, on the morning of the 30th, in McLeish's own hand, in heavy red fountain pen ink across the bottom half of the original memorandum, in the precise traditional language of railroad engineering field corrections. The amendment read, "We were wrong. The consist was reached, and the passengers were recovered by Mr. Sigurd Lindquist of Cherry County, Nebraska, civilian with a 1924 Advanced Rumely OilPull Model H kerosene tractor between the afternoon of January 28th and the evening of January 29th, 1949, at a sustained ambient temperature of -36 to -38 degrees Fahrenheit, without loss of life. H. McLeish, Senior Engineer, UP Omaha. The amendment, with the original operations memorandum still attached, was hand-carried by Frank Vacek to the Valentine Division offices on the 2nd of February 1949, and from Valentine to the Union Pacific General Manager's office in Omaha by the Tuesday morning of the 7th. It was read in person by the General Manager, a 61-year-old man named Edward Mailer, at his desk on the morning of the 8th. By the afternoon of the same day, Edward Mailer had dictated a formal letter on Union Pacific Railroad Company, letterhead to Sigurd Lindquist, of Rumely, Nebraska, that thanked Mr. Lindquist, on behalf of the Union Pacific Railroad, of every one of the 141 passengers of stranded passenger consist number 47, and of every Union Pacific employee on the North Platte Valentine branch for the rescue of the 28th and 29th of January. The letter included a check for $15,000 made out to Mr. Lindquist personally, drawn on the Union Pacific Railroad Company account at the First National Bank of Omaha, which Edward Mailer described in the letter as an honorable but inadequate civilian recovery fee, the upper figure my own office is authorized to issue without board approval. Sigurd Lindquist received the letter and the check on the 11th of February. He read the letter twice at his own kitchen oilcloth table in the low sod-and-frame ranch house, in his sheepskin chore coat, with Karen beside him. He set the check on the table between them. He drank half a cup of coffee. Then he stood up, walked through the back hall, out the kitchen door, across the snow-packed yard, to the cottonwood-pole hay shed where the oil pull was parked under its small canvas dust cover, laid his chopper-mitted right hand briefly on the cold cooling tower radiator, and walked back to the house. He wrote a single-page reply to Edward Mailer that evening at the same kitchen table, in pencil, on a sheet of plain ranch stationery. The reply read, in full, "Mr. Mailer, I have your letter and your check. The oil pull and I did the work. We are obliged you would offer the fee. I do not require it. I would ask, sir, with respect, that the $15,000 be placed in a Union Pacific Railroad Company scholarship account at the University of Nebraska College of Engineering in Lincoln, to be awarded by the college at $1,500 a year for the next 10 years to one Cherry County, Nebraska, ranch boy or ranch girl going to the college in mechanical engineering. The first one I will pick myself. 9 the college will pick. Their last names should not be Lindquist. I would ask further that no portion of the fee or the scholarship be made public. Yours sincerely, Sigurd Lindquist Brownlee, Nebraska." Edward Mailer received the letter on the 16th of February, 1949. He read it twice. He walked alone, the 420 feet from his office, in the Union Pacific Building in Omaha, to the Union Station Telegraph Office, and he sent a single Western Union telegram to Sigurd Lindquist at Brownlee, Nebraska, that read, in full, "Mr. Lindquist will be done." Exactly as you have written it. E. Mailer, General Manager, Union Pacific Railroad Company. The fund was established at the University of Nebraska College of Engineering in Lincoln in the spring of 1949. It was named against Sigurd Lindquist's specific written request, the Lindquist Sandhills Engineering Scholarship, by unanimous vote of the college's scholarship committee over the personal objection of the general manager of the Union Pacific Railroad, who had been told to honor Mr. Lindquist's preferences in this matter and was not, by the college, permitted to. The first scholarship was awarded in the autumn of 1950 to a 19-year-old Cherry County ranch girl from Ely, Nebraska, named Eleanor Bender, who had been the 11-month-old infant Walter Henderson had handed to Sigurd Lindquist on the brass platform of the last Pullman car of stranded UP passenger consist number 47 at 1:41 in the morning on the 29th of January, 1949. Eleanor Bender did not, on the day of the scholarship award, know any of that. She would learn it from her mother on her 21st birthday in 1969. She would, by 1992, be a distinguished professor of emergency medicine and trauma surgery at the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha. She would, in the spring of 1993, fund the perpetual endowment of the Lindquist Sandhills Engineering Scholarship out of her own savings, by which time the scholarship had run continuously for 43 straight years and had supported 43 Cherry County ranch children through the University of Nebraska College of Engineering, of whom 31 had returned to the Sandhills to live. Sigurd Lindquist lived another 19 years. He died on the 11th of March, 1968, 95 years old, of pneumonia, in the same low sod-and-frame ranch house, in the same brass bed in which Karen Lindquist had died of a quiet stroke in 1964, with the fur-lined leather aviator cap still on the post of the bed. He was buried beside Karen in the small Swede Methodist Mission Cemetery at Brownlee, Nebraska, in a service that drew Howard McCleish, now retired, 67. Frank Vacek, now Valentine Division Superintendent, 58. Eleanor Bender, now a third-year resident in emergency medicine in Omaha, 19. And most of the surviving old ranchers of 3 counties. His headstone is plain Nebraska granite, with his name and his dates and one line beneath them. The line, written into his will in his own hand in 1961, reads, "In the calm Sandhills English with the Swedish edge." Sigurd Lindquist, 1873 to 1968. He walked it home at 530 revolutions a minute. The 1924 Advanced Rumely OilPull Model H sits today in the Sandhills Heritage Center Museum in Valentine, Nebraska, in a climate-controlled hall. The custom-welded, oversized cleated grousers Sigurd Lindquist welded on with his own bench arc welder in the winter of 1925, still on the original Rumely steel spoke drive wheels. The plaque beside it, set there by the Union Pacific Railroad Historical Society in 1974, lists the year of manufacture, the original purchase price, and the date of January 28th to 29th, 1949. The 5th line of the plaque, in slightly larger type, reads, "Walked 141 passengers off the Cody Drift at -38°F when modern equipment could not." And on the floor of the museum hall beside the oil pull, set in a small protected display case under non-reflective glass, is a single document on heavy buff Union Pacific Railroad Company letterhead, signed by Howard McCleish at the bottom, in his own hand, dated the 30th of January, 1949. It is the Formal Operations Memorandum, 47-D, the document Howard McCleish had signed on the morning of the 28th. The document that had formally declared the consist unreachable until the spring thaw with, across the bottom half of the page in heavy red fountain pen ink in McCleish's own clean engineering hand, the 3 short words, "We were wrong." And beneath the 3 red words, in the same red ink, the same hand, one further line, "Sigurd Lindquist, civilian, was right. H. McCleish, senior engineer, UP Omaha." If this story stayed with you, there are more like it on this channel, Forgotten Machines, Quiet People, and the Work They Did. Subscribe, and we'll tell you the next one.